So today, just bear with me a second. Yeah, I just want to get this slideshow going. Right. Okay, thank you. Okay, so today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about a love story. I am sorry about all this. Sort of need a technical assistant who knows what they're doing. So the love story we're going to talk about today isn't this one. Although there are similarities. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex have removed themselves from the royal family. Right, we'll just skip that up. But as you have removed themselves from the royal family, just as Harry's great uncle, Edward VIII, did in 1936. Edward's bomb throwing wasn't as public as the Sussexes, but, as you'll find out this morning, it was potentially more lethal. Today you'll find out why we should be thankful Edward VIII abdicated. It was a disaster averted. I'm sure you know Edward VIII's love story. The king who gave up his throne for the woman he loved. Had he not, we could be talking about the king who gave up his country for his ego. Before we get into that, let's talk about the abdication that shook the British nation and empire to the core. Edward VIII was a dapper, dandy, and dedicated to fashion. He was a popular new royal. We seem to have a bit of disconnection here between what's going on the laptop and what's going on the screen. But anyway, I'll keep going. So Edward was denied his destiny because the government and his family deemed the woman he loved was not a suitable wife. And we may think, how dare they deny him his happiness, deny him the support he needed to discharge the duties of his onerous office. We are on his side, and he did all he could to make sure we were. In his abdication speech on radio on the 11th of December 1936, he told the world, "You must believe me when I tell you that I found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. This was a thing I had to judge entirely for myself. The other person most nearly concerned has tried to the last to persuade me to take a different course." He made 2 points here. First, he could not do the job without Mrs. Simpson. And second, she was not a nation wrecker hell-bent on becoming queen. On the contrary, he said she tried to dissuade him from abdicating. There's evidence for this other than his words. She wrote to her former husband, Ernest Simpson, that she had doubts, that she did not want him to abdicate. And she publicly offered to end the relationship. The upper-class rumour mill had it that Mrs. Simpson was a gold digger, determined to be the queen, and had used her feminine wiles to force Edward to do what she wanted. There's no doubt Edward was in love with the American twice-divorced Mrs. Simpson. Some say he was obsessed by her and followed her around like a puppy dog. Love was the official reason for the government's opposition to the marriage. The king was the head of the Church of England that forbade marrying divorcees. So let's have a look at the consequences of the abdication. First, George VI was an effective and committed king. Despite being the shy, reticent, stuttering second in line who never thought he would wear the crown. Despite his apparent unsuitability to be the king at the start of his reign, most historians agree he grew into the job. From July to September 1940, the Nazi Air Force bombed London and other major English cities almost every night. Bomb them into submission was the Nazi strategy, and then they'd invade. They didn't have to go far to invade, just 45 metres across the English Channel from France. The United States had not entered the war at this stage, and the fear of invasion in England was well founded. At this stage of the war, the German army was an undefeated juggernaut, steamrolling everything before it. The British government wanted to move the royal family to the safety of Canada. The king refused. Instead, the king and queen stayed in Buckingham Palace. Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret went to Windsor Castle. The king and queen went to bombed suburbs to provide comfort and support to those whose homes and lives had been destroyed. Their behaviour is a stark contrast to that of Edward, before and during the war. We'll come to that shortly. The second benefit of the abdication was that George VI's successor, his daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, who became an exemplary monarch for 7 decades. Third, if Edward VIII had been on the throne in the lead up to the Second World War and during it, there could have been a constitutional crisis that would have made the abdication look like a minor disagreement. There's evidence, plenty of evidence, that Edward was a Nazi sympathiser and was talking to senior party members, including the German Minister for Foreign Affairs, von Ribbentrop, about post-invasion arrangements. We know the wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill's position: unconditional surrender. Edward, Albert, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick, David was born on the 23rd of June 1894. His family called him David. We'll call him, for what we know him as, Edward. His grandmother, Queen Victoria, died in January 1901 when Edward was 6. His father and mother, the Duke and Duchess of York, went away for 9 months on a tour that traversed the British Empire, including Australia. Edward and his siblings stayed in Britain with their grandparents, Queen Alexandra and King Edward VII. When his parents came back, the children were placed in the care of 2 men, Frederick Finch and Henry Hansell, who virtually brought them up. Private tutors taught them German and French. Edward entered the Royal Naval College, Osborne, in 1907, and after 2 years went to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. He joined the Grenadier Guards in June 1914, and when Britain entered the First World War, he wanted to serve at the front. But the Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, forbade it. The risk of capture was too great. Undeterred, Edward went to the front as often as he could and witnessed trench warfare. This had an indelible effect on him and was his motivation for his support of appeasement, along with a lot of other upper-class people in the 1930s. Although his role in the First World War was limited, he was awarded the Military Cross in 1916, and his involvement made him popular with soldiers. He was also popular with women, some of whom were married. He had numerous affairs and an appetite for partying. By 1930, at the age of 36, Edward showed no sign of relinquishing his playboy lifestyle. His father, George V, reportedly told a courtier, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. And on another occasion, the king said, "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie, George VI, and Lilibet, Queen Elizabeth II, and the throne." It wasn't only married women with whom Edward was having affairs. Biographer Andrew Lowney provides evidence in his book, Trader King, that Edward also had sexual relationships with men. Anne Seagram, who worked for the Windsors in the 1950s, wrote he was uncertain about his sexuality. Charles Higham wrote a biography of Mrs Simpson, published in 2004. He claimed a close friend of Edward's, Edward Metcalfe, was an active homosexual and they had a physical affair. A condition of the provision of the information was that it had been made public after Forward's death. Metcalfe's nickname, by the way, was Fruity. One of Edward's female lovers, Thelma Furness, was a close friend of Bessie Wallace Warfield Simpson. Mrs Furness introduced Mrs Simpson at her country house to the Prince of Wales in January 1931. They didn't become lovers until January 1934, when Thelma was in the United States visiting her sister. Edward made it clear when he returned that their relationship was over, and another lover, Freda Dudley Ward, was also discarded. Edward became obsessed by Mrs Simpson and was thoroughly in her thrall by the end of 1934. Philip Ziegler, one of Mrs Simpson's biographers, wrote that Edward had become slavishly dependent on her. She was domineering and indifferent to his position, both of which appealed to him. So there's where I mentioned that she publicly declared that she was willing not to go ahead with the marriage, and that was a story from December 1936, the month of the abdication. This was London during the Blitz. This is the Queen Mother, the Queen at the time, among bombed ruins. And we know who that is. And that's Edward VIII. And that's Edward VIII as a baby. Isn't he sweet? Queen Victoria, you probably know her. This is Edward as a child with his siblings. Edward in the Grenadier Guards. And he did like having a good time. And that's the book to which I referred. That's Edward and Edward Metcalfe. And these are his female lovers at the time that he met Mrs Simpson. That's the biography I was talking about. And I think we might have got up to here, Philip Ziegler, who wrote that Edward had become very dependent on her. And the English newspapers had not reported on the romance until early December 1936. Edward summoned Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to Buckingham Palace and said he wanted to marry Mrs Simpson when her divorce was finalised. Baldwin told him his subjects would deem the marriage morally unacceptable because remarriage after divorce was opposed by the Church of the Church, of which the King, as he was then, was the head. The Dominion governments were consulted and most opposed, including Australia. Edward, though, dismissed the Australian rejection because there weren't many people there. In 1920, when he visited Australia, he wrote of Indigenous Australians, and I warn you, his language is offensive. They are the most revolting form of living creatures I've ever seen. They are the lowest known form of human beings and are the nearest thing to monkeys. Baldwin told the king that he had 3 options. First, give up the idea of marrying Mrs. Simpson, or marry against his minister's wishes, and if he did, the government would resign, or abdicate. A Liberal Member of Parliament, Robert Bernays, wrote in his diary at the time, "The King has never passed the stage from boyhood to manhood. He is the spoiled child of success with the film star mentality. He sees his job only in terms of cheering crowds." Well, there were plenty of cheering crowds during Edward's 1920 Empire tour, but for him, it was too much like hard work. He wrote to a friend, "Christ, how I loathe my job now and all the press-puffed empty success. I feel I'm through with it and long to die." Nothing dramatic about him, is there? "For God's sake, don't breathe a word of this to a soul. No one must know how I feel about my life." In 1928, Edward's Assistant Principal Private Secretary, Tommy Lascelles, wrote, "The heir apparent in his unbridled pursuit of wine and women, and whatever selfish whim occupied him at the moment, was rapidly going to the devil, and, unless he mended his ways, would soon become no fit wearer of the British crown." Lascelles, in his book, Royal Service, recounted a conversation with Baldwin. "I can't help thinking that the best thing that could happen to him and the country would be for him to break his neck." "God forgive me," said Baldwin, "I had often thought the same." Unsuitability for the role wasn't the only concern Baldwin and others had about Edward. There was something far more sinister and far more potentially dangerous. Support of Hitler in the 1930s among the English aristocracy and influential people was common. And it was understandable because a lot of these people and the whole country had been through the First World War and seen what a horrible slaughter it was. And no one wanted to do that again. So there were good reasons for appeasement. Britain had its own right-wing fascist party called the British Union of Fascists that was led by Oswald Mosley, Sir Oswald Mosley. In January 1936, when Edward became king, the Nazis hadn't embarked on their horrific state-sponsored industrial-scale mass murder. But any reasonably informed British person would know the Nazis persecuted Jews, imprisoned their political enemies, and murdered others. The fear of another war in Europe was pervasive. Churchill was one of the few British politicians in the 1930s who spoke out against the Nazis. Now, some people may say that the Nazis had many supporters among the British aristocracy, and that was certainly the case. But usually, that as an explanation or excuse for Edward's egregious behaviour isn't supported by the evidence. So he was much more than just an appeaser. He was much more than someone who just thought that we should do what we can to prevent another war. He was much more than a Nazi sympathiser. He was a traitor. He worked with the Nazis to regain the throne after Britain declared war on Germany. But his pro-Nazi politics began long before the war. Baldwin was aware of this, and he asked MI5 to keep Edward under surveillance. Soon after, Edward became king. Baldwin, by the way, was not the first to ask MI5 to keep an eye on Edward. Edward's father, George V, also did, and he asked for Mrs. Simpson to be watched. This is extraordinary. This is the head of government asking the security agencies to keep an eye on the head of state whom he clearly didn't trust. Baldwin wanted the surveillance for 5 reasons. First, he was concerned the king would be blackmailed because he spent such vast amounts of money on Mrs. Simpson. Second, he kept the company of right-wingers and fascist sympathisers such as Mosley. Third, Baldwin was worried Edward could try and subvert his government to keep himself on the throne. Fourth, there were serious fears that whatever happened, the affair with Mrs. Simpson could trigger strikes or riots throughout the country. And fifth, there was concern about Mrs. Simpson's pro-Nazi sympathies. As well as the surveillance, Baldwin took another precaution. Government documents set in red boxes to the king were screened by the Foreign Office to ensure that nothing highly secret could go astray. The surveillance and the censorship of what documents the king saw are the actions of someone trying to avert a disaster. Baldwin's fears about Edward's pro-Nazi predilection were not misplaced and were known beyond the political establishment. The day of the abdication, 3,000 people went to a rally addressed by Sir Oswald Mosley, who demanded the abdication be put to the people. On the 14th of December 1936, 3 days before the abdication, a friend of Edward's, Harold Nicholson, had lunch with Edward's former Assistant Private Secretary, Tommy Lascelles, who we heard about earlier. Nicholson wrote in his diary, Lascelles was so relieved at the fall of his master that he was almost indiscreet. He says, the king was like the child in the fairy story who was given every gift except a soul. There was nothing in him which understood the intellectual or spiritual sides of life, and that all art, poetry, music, etc. were dead to him. He had no friends in this country, nobody whom he could ever wish to see again. I noticed something about that quote, you might have as well, that all art, poetry, etc. were dead to him. Our language is interesting and phrases come in and out of fashion. Something that's dead to us is relatively new. I'm not saying it wasn't said, but I was surprised when I read it, because this was written supposedly in 1936. So the abdication certainly averted disaster, but the abdication did not solve the problem of Edward. He continued to be a thorn in the side of British governments for decades because of his Nazi connections, even after the war was over. A week after the abdication, the diplomat Orme Sargent recorded Hitler was very distressed at the turn that affairs had taken in this country, since he looked upon the late king as a man after his own heart and one who understood the Führerprinzip and was ready to introduce it into this country. The Führerprinzip is a system of government in which the leader's word is above all written law, and that policies and decisions, as well as those of bureaucrats and other government officials, should all work towards the realisation of this end. So in other words, what the Führer wants, the Führer should get, and we should be anticipating what he would want and implement it. And if we didn't, the consequences were pretty dire. Edward and Mrs. Simpson decided to marry on the 12th of May 1937 after the coronation of King George VI. They announced their engagement and wedding date on Coronation Eve. And their wedding day, the 3rd of June 1936, was Edward's father's, George V's, birthday. Some things don't change. King Charles' coronation will be on the 6th of May, the 4th birthday of Harry and Meghan's son Archie. The extent... Oh, excuse me. Not long after the abdication, a story in the New York Times was published in which Mrs. Simpson denied wanting to be Queen, denied stealing royal jewellery, denied having an affair with Ribbentrop. These was just some of the rumours about her that had circulated throughout the early 1930s. No member of the royal family attended the wedding, but the King and Queen sent a telegram. "We are thinking of you with great affection and send you every wish for your future happiness." Winston and Clementine Churchill sent a plate. Adolf Hitler sent a gold box. The newlyweds left for their honeymoon in a convoy of cars to join the Simplon Orient Express, which had been waiting for them. There were 186 trunks, 80 additional items of luggage, and among the entourage were 2 Scotland Yard detectives. And those detectives were there to protect the former king and his wife, as well as to spy on them. Their destination was a 40-room castle in the Carinthian Mountains in Central Europe. It was the German home of Count Paul Munster, who was close to Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. Edward and Mrs. Simpson were there for 3 months. They entertained friends. They swam in the castle's pool and played golf and tennis and went beer stalking. At the Hotel Bristol in Vienna on the 20th of June 1936, they had dinner. An American official at the dinner told Edward that a train from Germany to Italy had crashed, and naval shells supplied by Germany to Mussolini's navy had been discovered. This breached the League of Nations sanctions imposed after the First World War, sanctions imposed on Germany. Days later, the American official was shown an intercepted telegram sent by the Italian ambassador to Rome discussing the discovered shells and revealing its source. Who was Edward? So the extent of the Nazis' cruel, oppressive and industrial scale mass murder during the Second World War wasn't well known until after the war ended. But the Nazis' anti-Semitism, concentration camps and other restrictions of civil liberties, as I said earlier, were well known. This is the Dachau concentration camp, just outside Munich. It opened on the 22nd of March 1933. It opened 1 month and 23 days after Hitler became Chancellor. The Nazis' oppression and abuse of human rights were excused because of the extreme economic times and the threat of communist revolution. And these 2 factors required an extreme response. The Nazis had brought order, work and hope back to Germany. And although Germany and Britain had fought each other in the Great War, they had a long history of connection, including through their respective royal families. Edward spoke fluent German and sometimes referred to it as his mother tongue. He told the British aristocrat Diana Moseley, the wife of Sir Edward Moseley, "Every drop of blood in my veins is German." There are a few reasons for Edward's pro-German position. First, as we said, he was an appeaser. Second, he was a vehement anti-communist. The murder of Edward's Russian relations, the royal family of that country in 1918, had a profound effect on him. And he always considered communism, not Nazism, as the real threat to Britain's interests and empire. The Nazis were rabid anti-communists, and many people thought that they were a better option and that they would certainly stop a communist revolution from happening. Edward's pro-Nazi position was strong. In July 1933, when he was the Prince of Wales, he had a conversation with the journalist Robert Lockhart, who noted in his diary, the Prince of Wales was quite pro-Hitler and said it was no business of ours to interfere in Germany's internal affairs, either re Jews or anything else. And added that dictators are very popular these days, and we might want one. We might want one in England before now. In mid-1937, there was talk of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor's intention to visit other countries. And that talk reached the British government and royal family. King George VI ordered that the couple were not to be invited to stay in any embassy. And there could be no official entertainment for them at an embassy. On the 20th of September 1937, Edward told a British diplomat about a tour of Germany that was purely private in nature, even though the German government were organising it and paying for it. By the way, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor didn't pay for anything. The visit's purpose was a fact-finding mission to see what is being done to improve working and living conditions of labouring classes in several larger German cities. On Monday, the 11th of October, the Duke and Duchess arrived in Berlin at the International Railway Station, and that was covered with Union Jacks and SWAT stickers. After welcoming the party, among the welcoming party was the head of the German National Labour Front, Robert Ley, who was their tour host. The National Labour Front was a government organisation that replaced all trade unions that had been outlawed. Among other things, the front suppressed wages. Ley was an alcoholic, and while driving Edward and Mrs. Simpson on one occasion, he crashed into a gate. They were unhurt. The Windsors were assigned 2 servants. Their protection officer, unknown to the servants, spoke French and German. The protection officer kept MI5 informed about what went on and what they did. The Nazis rolled out the red carpet to their British visitors. Ley hosted a dinner at his 37-room house in the Grunwald, attended by the German ambassador to the UK, Ribbentrop, Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, the chief of police, Heinrich Himmler, who you can see there in the middle, and on the right is the propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, among other things, many other things, hosted the couple for an afternoon tea at his hunting lodge, Carrenhall. On the 22nd of October, the couple arrived in Munich for the highlight of their trip. And this was what it was all about, that photo. So they were to have tea with Hitler, but one of the things that Edward asked was for his wife to be treated as a royal, and the royal family refused to do that, and that was a sticking point with Edward. Wallace later wrote about Hitler's patsy pallor under his moustache. His lips were fixed in a kind of mirthless grimace. His eyes were truly extraordinary, intense, unblinking, magnetic. One of the British party, Dudley Forward, who we mentioned earlier, was unimpressed. Hitler, he said, was a funny little man sitting beside Edward. He didn't impress me as a great person. The former king, though, impressed Goebbels. The Duke is wonderful, a nice, sympathetic figure who is open and clear and with a healthy understanding of people. It's a shame he is no longer king. With him, we would have entered into an alliance. Wallace was impressed with Goebbels. Though disparaging about his physique, the club-footed mastermind of the Nazi propaganda mills impressed me as the cleverest of the lot, a tiny, wispy gnome with an enormous skull. His wife was the prettiest woman I saw in Germany, a blonde with enormous blue eyes and a flair for clothes. Seen together, they reminded me of Beauty and the Beast. The Duke and Duchess left Germany on the 24th of October 1937, and 2 years later, when the Second World War began, you would think Edward and Mrs. Simpson would curtail their Nazi supporting activities since their country was at war with Germany. They didn't. The Spanish Foreign Minister wrote to General Franco relaying a conversation with Edward, who was against the war. He said Edward blamed the Jews, the Reds and the British. He blamed the Reds, the Jews, and British Foreign Minister Anthony Eden and his bureaucrats. He implied they should all be shot. German bombing of England effectively could bring peace. It would seem very much to hope that this would occur. He wants peace at any price. Well, if this is true, it gives us an insight into the mind of the former king. He reputedly said German bombing of England effectively could bring peace. In other words, the former head of state of the United Kingdom supported the murder of his people and the destruction of their property. At the same time, the head of the Soviet spy agency sent a memo to the Kremlin, presumably based on reports from his agents. The former King of England, Edward, together with his wife Simpson, is at present in Madrid, where he is in touch with Hitler. Edward is conducting negotiations with Hitler on the question of the formation of a new English government and the conclusion of peace with Germany contingent on a military alliance against the USSR. Churchill, now Prime Minister, was a long-standing friend of Edward's who had tried to find a compromise in the abdication crisis. But now, Edward was causing another crisis, and Churchill, now Prime Minister, was determined to neutralise him by removing him from Europe. Churchill's solution? Appoint Edward Governor of the Bahamas. But for the former king and emperor of an empire on which the sun never set, it was a humiliation. The job was so low in the diplomatic pecking order that it did not require a knighthood to do. New Zealand and South Africa gives an insight, a top secret memo Churchill sent to the Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia and New Zealand gives an insight into his reasoning. We'll talk about that memo after a little break, a little leg stretch and a cup of something, and then it'll give me an opportunity to get my notes and slides in order. So let's meet again in how many minutes, someone who's in charge?
Yeah, it's probably in about 20 minutes.
In about 20 minutes. Okay, thanks very much everyone for staying. It looks as though we haven't lost too many people, so that could be a good sign. So, we got up to Churchill's memo, didn't we, to the Prime Ministers of Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. So, in this memo, Churchill said, the activities of the Duke of Windsor on the continent in recent months have been causing His Majesty and myself grave uneasiness, as his inclinations are well known to be pro-Nazi and he may become a centre of intrigue. We regard it as a real danger that he should move freely on the continent. Even if he were willing to return to this country, his presence here would be most embarrassing both to His Majesty and to the government. We know the basis of Churchill's well-founded fears thanks to a United States Army captain, David Silverberg. He was advancing across the Harz Mountains in Germany's north on the 12th of April 1945, just before the end of the war, when he came across an abandoned German vehicle around which papers were strewn. One of the papers was signed by the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, so he knew that these papers could be of some importance. Captain Silverberg and his troops found archives in nearby castles that included a copy of the 1939 Non-Aggression Pact Germany and Russia had signed. More than 1,200 tons of files were found, including top-secret telegrams between Ribbentrop and the German ambassador to Madrid about Edward and Mrs. Simpson. In a top-secret telegram, Ribbentrop, now the German Minister for Foreign Affairs, sent to the German ambassador to Spain on the 11th of July, Ribbentrop wrote, "The Duke must be informed that Germany wants peace with the English people and that the Churchill clique stands. It will be a good thing if the Duke would hold himself in readiness for further developments. Germany is determined to force England to peace by every means of power, and upon this happening would be prepared to accommodate any desire expressed by the Duke, especially with a view to the assumption of the English throne by the Duke and Duchess." So there it is in black and white. So note these last words, the assumption of the English throne by the Duke and Duchess. Here is the Nazis' plan spelt out by one of the regime's senior ministers. The language could not be any clearer. And it seems to me that alone is evidence enough that Edward's abdication was indeed a disaster averted. In May 1940, Edward and Mrs. Simpson were in Lisbon, the guests of Espirito Santo Silva, the head of a bank of the same name and known to siphon funds to German agents. MI5 agent Guy Liddell, who read some of the documents, says Edward saw himself as a mediator, and he talked to the Germans about the possibility of him being restored to the throne. On the 11th of August 1940, the Duke and Duchess were on the SS Excalibur when it left Lisbon. The Windsors didn't want to be on the boat, headed for the Bahamas and the assumption of the governorship of that colony. and they had an unhappy 5 years there. They knew it was the exile it was intended to be. They took every opportunity to travel to the United States. But they did have rather a nice house to live in. It had 7 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 24 other rooms, and it was on 10 acres of garden in the heart of Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas. It faced the water. It was surrounded by hedges and purple bougainvillea with rubber trees and an avenue of giant royal palms. But it wasn't good enough for the former king and his would-be queen. A total of $700,000 in today's Australian dollars was spent on the building, including adding a 3-storey wing to accommodate staff. The spending didn't stop on buildings. A Saks Fifth Avenue, New York City hairdresser was regularly flown in by the Duchess. Flowers came from Miami. Lord Lothian, the British ambassador in Washington, wrote, "The impression in the United States was that Edward wasn't taking his duties seriously. Indeed, according to some reports, he was drunk most of the time." They might have been banished to where Churchill thought that they could do the least harm, but it wasn't long before they resumed their treasonous activities. There's evidence they were still in contact with the Nazis during their tenure in the Bahamas. The United States government was suspicious, and the FBI spied on them when they were in the United States. Edward and Mrs. Simpson ended up in France after the war, sponging off the French government that provided a mansion of the standard to which they were accustomed. They had 16 servants, including 2 chauffeurs, a butler, a famous French chef. The servants' clothes were designed by Edward: scarlet coats with gold cuffs for formal occasions, and black suits with crimson, white, and gold striped waistcoats for during the day. Royal protocol was mandatory. Guests bowed or curtsied to the former king and his wife on first seeing them in the morning. Edward's secretary had to stand to take dictation. They were demanding employers. Wrote one former employee, "A drop plate, a careless intrusion, or a slip in attentiveness could be counted upon to bring a swift dressing down, followed by sacking. The hours were long, praise was scanty. It is doubtful that any household staff in all Paris was driven as hard as the one that served the Windsors." They decided the exact shade and size of their personal notepaper and menu cards and how they should be engraved. Their luggage labels were printed according to their instructions, and together they chose the design and colourings of their Christmas cards. So in other words, they had a pretty sad life. Edward died of throat cancer on the 28th of May 1972 at the age of 77. 10 days before, the Queen visited during an official visit to France. The Duchess went to the funeral in London and stayed at Buckingham Palace. She died on the 24th of April 1986 at the age of 89. In her later years, she had dementia, and in the last 6 years of her life, she could not speak. She was financially supported by Edward's estate and an allowance from the Queen. But Bessie Wallace Warfield Simpson did us all a favour. She prevented an unintelligent, pro-Nazi, lazy and foolish man becoming the King of Great Britain at a critical time in history. If Edward had stayed on the throne, there is no doubt he would have at least talked to the Nazis about making peace and putting him back on the throne. At worst, aiding and abetting their invasion of Britain. Edward's abdication was a disaster avoided. Now, does anyone have any questions, queries, comments or criticisms? Well, I'd like to say that I'm responsible for some of these technical hiccups we had. I'm sorry about that. Yes, sir.
Do you think they deliberately decided not to have any children?
Well, she was too old. She was well into her 40s when they married. She was a little bit older than him.
She didn't have any children from her other marriages?
No. No, she was never a mother. Yes.
How come that their establishment, or his establishment, the Duke of Windsor, was continued to be regarded or maintained by Britain after all this occurred, and knowing what happened in the Bahamas and post-war in France?
Well, look, what happened in the Bahamas and did everyone hear the question? So
Can I ask something? Sorry. Through all his affairs through the years, we have never been told, and maybe there wasn't. Was there ever child born through all these affairs that he had?
Let's deal with this first question, and we'll come back to that. So the gentleman at the back was saying, why was the title Duke of Windsor? Why was he allowed to maintain that? To continue to have that title and for her to have her title even after this treasonous activity was apparent. I think that the reason for that would be that would cause a lot of controversy because people would ask, well, why is the royal family doing that? And would appear to be very spiteful. And they didn't want this information to come out. They never wanted this information to come out. They fought hard to keep it in the archives. So it was largely the discovery of the documents by the US Captain Silverton, that was all hushed up and kept secret for many years. And another question, and can you remind me what you were...
Well, okay, through the years, even before he married
Yeah.
once, and with all his numerous affairs...
Yes, yeah.
Was there any children?
As far as I'm aware, he didn't become a father, no. But he had numerous affairs. And I think the reason for the numerous affairs and the marriage to Wallace are because of emotional immaturity. I just think this man was very emotionally immature. And there was a quote there from someone who knew him. He said, look, basically, he just didn't grow up. And I think that he latched on to Wallace because he saw in her someone who was strong, who he could lean on. And she wanted out. And I think that you could argue that he imprisoned her. And he took her life from her. And sure, they led a very comfortable and elaborate life. They didn't want for anything materially, but towards the end of their lives, they were treated as a joke. I didn't include a quote from Richard Burton, and they entertained him and Elizabeth Taylor on one occasion, and they were very disparaging and basically saying they were both off the show and, were reliving the days of the abdication and, yeah. Anybody else before we conclude? I'm conscious of the time. Yes, sir.
I was just thinking, it might not really relate, but I'm curious as to see whether you think any of these events had much influence on what happened in Russia later on.
I think that's a long bow to draw. I'm not sure about that. Certainly what's happening in Russia today is a consequence of the Second World War and the expansion of the Soviet Union after the war, and Putin wanting to restore the Soviet Union to what it was. So definitely a connection there. But yeah, I don't think there's one between that and the Duke and Duchess. Anybody else? Great. Well, look, thanks very much. I'll hand over to your esteemed MC.
Can I have that?
Thank you. Thank you.
So Neil, it was I don't know if you noticed, but you couldn't hear a pin drop. I noticed that. I mean, we're all very good usually. We listen very carefully, but yeah. But today I thought to myself, I couldn't hear a pin drop. I think people were really fascinated with the story you had to share with us today. It was so clear and easy to understand, and I don't know whether I became a bit more of a Republican than I sort of thought to myself, well, I know a few others who have lived. I mean, it beggars belief that they can live such a rich lifestyle when they're such terrible people. But yet, I think of Prince Andrew sort of gone along that road as well. You know, they want the lifestyle, so they find the people who will supply them with the money.
Yeah.
And they're a bit like leeches, aren't they,
Yes.
in that regard. But anyway, thank you so much for taking the time. It was a wonderful talk. Would you please show your appreciation?